Ok, ok, direi che possiamo cominciare. Can you speak only to check?
Yes.
Perfect. Ok. Allora, Esther Ronco oggi vive a Sydney, ma arriva dal Piemonte. In particolare, da che zona del Piemonte arriva la tua famiglia, Esther?
It is the story of Mario, my husband, who died in September last year.
Mhm.
He was born in Torino in 1927.
Ok. And after?
He was rejected at birth by his mother and brought up by his nonna until he was 15 when she died. Following that, he was alone. The authorities caught up with him and didn't like him living alone and sent him to live with his uncle in Milano.
Ok.
He was working at Fiat. He'd studied at Fiat when he was in Torino. He reported some corruption to the Germans when the Germans took over the factory, and he was afraid that he would be punished and fled to the mountains. And there he stayed for the last 9 months of the war to escape the fascists.
Okay. Where in the mountain?
In the mountains above Como.
Okay.
He would flee to the Swiss border to hide there when the fascists were around. And he stayed living in the barns and begging for food until he was told by the partisans that the war was over. He came down from the mountain, but when he reached the road on the left side of Como, he rounded a bend and bumped into Mussolini fleeing Italy.
Yes.
He was taken by the fascists. He was wearing a red shirt, which was made from the curtains of the house, and the fascists thought he was a communist, and they put him to the wall to shoot him. But I don't know if he panicked or what happened, but the next thing he remembers was he was walking through the streets of Como. I did not tell you the details of his life when he was a baby and how he was abandoned, but he received a message from his mother after the war. She was in a prisoner of war camp in Venice,
okay.
And he was contacted by her to see if he could help her get out of the prisoner of war camp. It was difficult for him because he was illegitimate by birth, and he was in those days considered an outcast, but eventually he managed to get her out of the camp. She promised that she would then make a home for them both, and he thought that he would eventually have a home and a mother and a family, but she promptly married a British officer and went to live in London. As a rebound from that, he married a girl from Fiat. As he wrote in the brief outline of his life that he wrote some years ago, he said that he was 18 and he had to look after himself. He married without knowing anything, and that the following years were a disaster. His wife left him for a friend, and as life with him was too difficult because he had no family and no resources. His uncle said that because of the circumstances he was in, the circumstances of his birth and the fact that he was married, he had no future in Italy, and he packed his trunk, caught the Orient Express and went to live in London, where his mother's husband gave him some support. His mother would not own him as her son. She was too beautiful. She did not want to be seen as being old enough to have a grown son. Life was difficult for him, but he learned English in the West End and made lots of friends with the ambassadors' children who were also at the school, but being in his situation, he couldn't pursue any friendships with them.
Okay.
He did get a job with the London Brick Company, and that was the very important step in his life. He spent 3 years in England. He was given a job with the London Brick Company, going around England doing research to extract the sulphur from the fumes from the brickworks because England was short of sulphur, as the Americans had commandeered it all for their munitions. There are many stories that I can tell of his time in England. He had trouble getting accommodation because he was Italian. He went to stay at one of the pubs in England, and it was blackmailed because there was an Italian staying there. Eventually, the company introduced him as a South African because by now his mother and her husband had moved to South Africa.
Oh.
He had joined the Ceramic Society in England, and he had given lectures on his research. Because of the background he had there, and the respect he had gained, he was able to get a job in South Africa managing a brickworks.
At what year now are we?
What year?
Yes.
He left Italy in 1951.
Yes.
He spent 3 years in England and
1954.
Yes, and he was 7 years in South Africa.
Okay.
He met his wife, Maria Magdalena Wessels, who was a well-bred daughter of the editor of the Afrikaans newspaper.
Oh.
She had some years later, in 1961, Australia came into his life. Australia then was a developing country, and the old fibro houses there were being replaced with brick houses, and the brick industry was beginning to be automated.
Okay.
An entrepreneur in Sydney had bought a brickworks, and the Swiss representative suggested that Mario go from South Africa to Sydney to show him how to use the brickworks. The entrepreneurs in those days had great foresight, and they really made Australia. There were no accountants, no lawyers. They made the decisions. They carried their accounts in the pocket and knew their staff. And Mario took the letter of recommendation from this company, and that was his entry into Australia. He arrived in Perth, and I think it was the big Melbourne Cup race day, and the customs agent was watching the television, and he just said, "There's the country, go for it." And Mario did. He worked hard. I can tell you lots of interesting stories along the way, but I'm not sure that you have the time. His life was full of stories and full of drama, and he entertained us all with his life later in life when he could face up to it. For many years he didn't speak of his early life because it was rather traumatic. But when he was in Australia, he worked extremely hard with the company that he was referred to. That particular company was the way of Australia. The easygoing attitude of Australians did not correspond very well with Mario's perfectionist approach to life, and they did. And Madeline have followed him from South Africa. A year later, she was homesick. They thought they would go back to South Africa, but the owner of the company said, "Why don't you form your own company under the umbrella of this company? And if you make a profit, that's all I ask." So this he did, and he did make a profit. And he worked all over Australia for this company, and still he joined the Australian Ceramic Society, gave lectures, and one evening he was giving a lecture, and the audience had eaten well and drunk well, and they weren't listening very much, but he kept going. And after they'd all left, a gentleman approached him, and he said, "Don't worry about those galas." He said, "Come and see me in my office in the morning." And he, which he did, and he met with the board of a bigger brick company, and they offered him a job at double the wages. He was immediately sent to South Australia to work to solve a lot of problems with a company there that were making pipes and roof tiles. This he did, and was sent to Singapore to worked all over Australia, and eventually was approached by another gentleman who had agencies for equipment in Europe, and he was asked to join him as a partner. So the two of them formed a company with $5,000 each. The principles of the company was that they would pay their accounts at the end of each month. They would not borrow money. A business. Mario was the technical man, and became really, I think, the technical godfather of the brick industry in Australia. They were, first of all, Mario had already worked on automating the feeding of the fuel to the kilns. Now they instead of loading the bricks manually, they installed tunnel kilns and automated lines all through the brickworks in Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and it was. I think they had over 30%, well over 30% of the business in the brick industry in Australia. His partner died, and Mario bought out the company and worked for many years until, in fact, the company still exists, but it's dealing with spare parts now. Mario was 88 when he died last year, so. He and the brick industry and Australia changed when the Whitlam government came in. Life was different. The accountants and lawyers ran the companies, and life was not so exciting, not so rewarding anymore. He worked with the Australians when they had not learnt to travel. They had not really learnt to become very sophisticated. When he first arrived in Australia, he was taken to the local service station for dinner. He wanted to reciprocate, and he had to look hard to find an Italian restaurant, and even harder to find a bottle of good wine. He eventually found a bottle of Barolo in a handmade bottle, and took it to the dinner which he had invited them to. They all came in and put their bottles of whiskey on the table. So he hid his Barolo under the chair and took it home. We enjoyed it many years later.
Only a question. In all this story, we have seen a person, but how he was connected with the Italian community in this traveling between London, South Africa, and Australia.
Right. When he came to Australia, he would frequently go back to Europe, spending months here sometimes. It's difficult to summarize his life because it was so full and so full of drama, and I started off trying to make it very brief, but I probably should have told you about his childhood so that you would understand his life more. But he felt, I think, because of his early life, he was an Italian without a family. He missed Italy. Although Australia was good to him, he was still an Italian, and he missed his mountains that he would climb in his youth. And so he used to come back to Europa each time he came back to Italy, just to say thank you for the privileges and the blessings that he had received. And often he was not well, and he would, if he had a surgery, he would come back to say thank you at the little church at Europa. He would bow his head in prayer. I came with him many times. He would light a candle and give his respects to the Madonna, and then we'd go for lunch, or we'd go up to the Monte Macrone. And this was his strength. It was his, he was not a greatly religious, outwardly religious, but internally he was very spiritual, and this was his pilgrimage each time he came back to Italy. Now, when I came into his life, he bought a 5-acre property on the outskirts of Sydney. It's like the country near the city, and it was an old cattle property. I turned it into a beautiful garden because I knew that one day he wouldn't be able to travel, and I thought this would be a good place for him to live. His wife developed Alzheimer's. She also lived there. We all lived together, and she died of a heart problem, and we married about 6 years ago. But because he couldn't travel, and he wanted to remember the mountains, he wanted to remember the Madonna, he requested the stonemason, the local stonemason, to build an Italian chapel. And in the Italian chapel he bought a copy of the Madonna Nera, and he put it in the chapel in the garden. And there, just close by, within view of the house on the hill, there is a Benedictine monastery. He became friends with the Italian priest there, and the Italian priest came up to the garden, and we had a dedication ceremony of the Black Madonna, which is on a YouTube video if you would like to see it. And when he became sick, and he felt quite insecure because he had no birth certificate, he had no record of his baptism, and one of the local Italians, we have a lot of Neapolitans, Calabrese and Sicilians in the area, and one of them contacted the Archbishop of Torino and found he'd never been baptized. So he was baptized in the local monastery, and he had his first communion in the garden by the Black Madonna. When he died last September, his funeral service was held partly in the chapel of the monastery, and then his coffin was brought to the garden, and there we had the rest of the service in the garden. I gave a lengthy eulogy which tells much more of the story, of his life, and that is in much more detail than the little summary he wrote earlier, and you're welcome to read that if you like. I can get a copy to you one way or another. But yes, I have come back to Italy now because of the invitation of the sanctuary, and I've also come back to arrange to bring some of his ashes to Bethlehem with his nonna.
Okay.
In Cimitero here.
Okay.
Now, I've missed out lots and lots of his story. That's a brief outline. But he, towards the end of his life, this is probably may not be necessary to tell, but you probably find it interesting. He always said that his mother, and I should have told you this earlier, the father of Maria's father was from Genoa. He prepared a home for them all with the nonna and the mother, but the father, I think he might have insulted the fascists, but he had to flee Italy from the fascists, and he went to Elizabethville in the Belgian Congo and started a business that had agencies of lots of Australian companies. I still got a copy of his letterhead. Pierina, Mario's mother, couldn't take Africa. She was beautiful, vain, and as Mario said in his description, that she was too beautiful and the promises of men were too great to refuse and resist. This is how he put it. And she left Africa. Since his death, I've found about 30 letters that the father wrote and the mother wrote to the nonna and to little Mariuccio, but the letters soon changed to only be signed by his father, and they were written to Pierina. So she left Africa very quickly, came back to Italy, would come and see Mario occasionally, but take the money out of his money box and give him presents that were taken away. I think his teachers he thinks the teachers were kind to him because they knew his circumstances. She couldn't bear it and brought him out again. For years he kept the little scarf that she'd wrapped around his neck because that was a symbol of her love for him. Then he told me later in life that just before he died, that the reason his mother was in the prisoner of war camp was not because, as he told me before, that she'd taken up with a deserter and he was shot and she was put in the camp. But she had, along with a group of others, that she was a secret British agent. And that the males in the group were shot and she was put in a prisoner of war camp in Venice. And he felt he had that period of insecurity again, that he was lost in the world, and that's when he told me. And I think he was ashamed that he was the son of, not only was he illegitimately born, his mother had betrayed her country. He was the son of a traitor, and that really upset him. So very interesting. Now, when he was in England, he was living in in a accommodation.
Sorry.
Behave with the British and
Okay.
approached there also by MI6 agents were, and which was interesting, which he did because he was able to travel to Europe with the business. Agents worked there. But before he died too, he told in the prison of war camp. It made me wonder if she was approached because may have associated him with her. I thought it was really interesting that in England by.
Esther, can you hear me?
I told him at least she was for the British North. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Because in the last 2 minutes there was a lot of problem in the line. I haven't understood anything you have said in the past 2 or 3 minutes. I think it's enough. It's very interesting, the history. When you reach Europa?
On the 7th. I will be here for tonight. Tomorrow I go to Carcane to Piacentino. One night here, and on Thursday I'll be in Europa.
Perfect. And you leave Europa, and did you return directly in Australia, or stay a lot of time in another part of Italy or in Europe?
I will leave. I think it's the 16th. I leave Europa, and I've arranged to stay in Torino for 4 nighs.
Oh, very interesting. We can meet each other directly in Torino.
Okay.
Okay. Now I record this interview. I check if there is it's possible to cut the last 2 minutes that I said that I have a lot of problem. And after I bring you a mail to inform you where I will put the video on YouTube or similar. Okay.
Okay.
Many thanks. I think I don't know if on 7 I could be in Europa, but on Saturday I think it's possible.
All right. Okay. I'm sorry that it was a bit disjointed because I was. If I had started in detail from the beginning, it would have flowed better. But I'm not sure what to say and what not to say.
Don't be afraid.
Because it's very lengthy.
Don't be afraid. Many thanks. Bye bye.
Okay.
Have a nice
night. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Ciao.
Ciao.